Hello, I'm Matt Scott, and this is a short video tutorial about the different types of human-computer interface. So what am I going to teach you about today? Well, by the end of this lesson, I'd like you to be able to understand the appropriate applications, input devices, advantages and disadvantages with a range of different user interfaces. And before I probably start, I should explain that a user interface is the way in which that a human interacts with a machine, be it through a screen or a microphone. And the ones we're going to look at today will be command line interfaces like MS-DOS, graphical user interfaces which like Windows or OS X, voice interfaces like when you speak to your phone maybe, speech recognition systems when they understand you, and natural language interfaces where they can actually interpret what you're saying, and finally speech synthesis where the machine will speak back to you. Sorts of exciting things. The first step is a bit of a task. I'd like you to look at each of these websites in turn, probably pause the video and then have a think about what sort of advantages and disadvantages there are in each of these approaches to interface. They're all web-based tools, so you don't need to have any special software installed. And in the NC Lab, you can use the username worth test and the password worth test, or you can set up your own account. And with the IKEA, you'll need to click Ask Anna, and with the simple shell, you'll need to start the shell running. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to turn off and then turn on a bit again in a bit. So hopefully you're back now after playing with them. We're going to go and have a look at them each individually in turn. So the first one I'm looking at is NC Lab. Now, despite being also a great place to learn about computer science, NC Lab represents essentially a graphical user interface in the way that there are menus when you click buttons, and you've got a pointer, as in the cursor, moving around your screen. You can right click on things to drag out menus, and there are icons. So those are Windows icons, menus and pointers, and that's a really intuitive interface for people to use. It's really simple to learn how to use. Unfortunately, it does incur quite a lot of processing power, which is why some people might be using another system which is called a command line interface. So when you go to the Simple Shell website, you can click Start My Session. This is a really nice way to learn Linux, which is an operating system, and in here this represents a command line interface. In fact, it represents the Linux command line interface, and you can type in commands. So if I start off with help, it then lists a whole range of different things that you can do. The disadvantage of using an operating system like this is that you'll really, to become any good at it, you need to actually remember all of the operations and what they do, and that can take a long time. However, it can be really powerful. Some of the annoying operations with a graphical user interface, like when you want to change the setting on a range of files, can be done in a single line in a command line interface, and that's why you find that computer experts actually quite like using a command line interface. The next approach I'd like you to look at is this Ask Anna, which is found at the IKEA home site. I think this is really interesting. So it's a automated assistant, but actually it's a natural language processing system. So you can ask Anna questions like, hello, how are you doing? And you can expect her to reply in an intelligent way. Now this uses a form of artificial intelligence which processes natural language and also learns from conversations they've had in the past, and this is called heuristics. And it forms a much more kind of natural way of talking to someone, because you can talk to them as if you're talking to another human. And there are limitations of software, and occasionally it gets things wrong, but I think this is a field of interface that will really, really improve in the future. Another type of interface you might be familiar with is the one that's being used on the Apple iPhone 4S, which is called Siri. I will attempt to play this and get a recording of it.
Read me the message.
New message from Sebastian. Great news. We got the go-ahead. Can you meet in 10?
Reply. Definitely. I'll see you there. Play my running mix. What's the traffic like around here?
Here's the traffic.
Text my wife. I'm going to be 30 minutes late.
Is it going to be chilly in San Francisco this weekend?
Not too cold. Maybe down to 61 degrees in San Francisco.
What about Napa Valley?
Doesn't seem like it.
How many cups are in 12 ounces?
Let me think. Okay, here you go.
Set my timer for 30 minutes.
Okay, 30 minutes and counting. New notification from messages. Sandy Jen, are we still on for dinner tonight?
Reply. Sure, I'll be there.
Here's your reply to Sandy Jen. Sure, I'll be there.
Send.
So within this system, we saw a range of different user interfaces. We saw speech recognition, where it could convert natural language into something the computer understands. We saw natural language processing, where the computer would then listen to what has been said and try and interpret the meaning behind it. And then finally, we saw voice output, where the computer would synthesize a human voice and speak back to us. So if we look at these different types of interface in a little bit more detail now. So we've got the graphical user interface, which was seen in the NC Labs. It's also what you'll be familiar with when you're using a desktop PC or a laptop, where you've got windows, icons, menus and pointers. These have been around a long time. The input device required for them is a mouse, and they're meant to form a very intuitive, natural way of manipulating data and files on a computer. The second one that we saw was the command line interface. Now, this doesn't require as much processing as a graphical user interface, and it can actually be quicker to perform commands on a range of different files in a single text entry. The downside is that you have to memorize every single command, and you need to be a real expert in order to use these. Then we went on and looked at the natural language interface, which was provided by the IKEA Annie, and we were able to have a kind of a chat conversation, and this is a form of artificial intelligence. In fact, a famous computer scientist called Alan Turing defined a test for artificial intelligence whereby a computer could be called intelligent if a human didn't know that they were having a conversation with a computer through a chat interface. The advantages of this are that it's really intuitive for a human to use, because people prefer to communicate in natural language, not points and clicks. The disadvantages is it's not really appropriate for handling files, for example, and also that it requires quite a lot of pre-programming. But an advantage of that is that it can learn over time, so it can engage in machine learning. Finally, one of the examples we looked at was the speech recognition system. This is where speech is converted into text that a machine like the Ask Annie could understand. And the example we looked at was Siri, whereby you would say something and then Siri would recognize the words that you were saying. And another aspect of Siri was getting the computer to talk back to you. And you'll probably be, if you don't have an iPhone, you may well have a GPS system in your car. One of the screens at TomTom, and they're probably the first mainstream application to use this. There was a thing called Microsoft Mary, which was used to read what was on the screen on Windows machines. However, I think that this is more sort of widely adopted, and the reason why TomTom uses a voice output is because when you're driving, you can't actually be looking at the screen all the time because you've got other things to do, and so it was a very sensible choice for TomTom to have voice output. And so the table here summates the advantages, disadvantages, and applications of all these different interfaces. We've got a command line interface, which is where you type in commands. There is an option where you'd have a menu-driven interface, which is slightly more usable within a command line interface. So in text, you'd be given options like press 1 to do this, press 2 to do this, press 3 to do this. If you've used a very old cache machine, it actually used a system like this. The advantages of a command line interface is it's actually really fast to jump between files, and you can configure the settings on file by batch in a very short by typing in a very short statement or command. The disadvantage is it's really hard to learn, and many of the command line interface operating systems don't do multitasking. So in a Windows operating system where you can have more than one window open at once and jump between programs, it's actually not as common in a command line interface for that to happen. The next section was the graphical user interface. This was the thing that used Windows icons, menus, and pointers, and used on many desktop PCs, both Apple and Windows alike. I suppose the key advantage is it's very easy to learn, but the disadvantage is that it's processor intensive. Moving on, you had speech recognition systems, and the most common form of speech recognition that I've seen at the moment is the Siri, and the input device required for that is a microphone. And it can be quite command driven, so it won't. It's not until you apply a natural language interface that it actually starts to interpret what you say. The advantages of it is that it's hands-free, and so you can control the computer without actually having to either look at a screen or use a mouse. The disadvantages is it's quite inaccurate and requires some for you to train the speech recognition software. The next thing that we've looked at is natural language interfaces. A good example of this is the IKEA Ask Anna, and this converts text into commands, and the Ask Anna will look up the correct response from a database of responses that have been successful in the past. This is known as a heuristic, and it's when it's a form of artificial intelligence. It's really intuitive. As I said, it uses machine learning, and it's great in kind of customer service applications. The disadvantage is that really Ask Anna has quite a finite domain. She's only really intelligent about things that are to do with IKEA. If you ask her the meaning to life and everything, I doubt that she'll have a sufficient answer. And then finally, we've got the speech synthesis, which just requires a computer and a speaker. And a good example of which is TomTom for the satellite navigation system. It's really accessible, so people who are blind, who have can't see the screen, could be using it. And also, it's very good for when you've got your attention on something else, and so you don't have a screen to look at. However, the sound does sound a bit creepy, and so it's not quite perfect human speech.